Family. The word itself represents love, safety, and trust. Yet in the darkest corners of our society, some homes become crime scenes. Some parents transform into murderers. Some children sleep with one eye open. The stories you're about to hear aren't from horror movies. They're real. In Fresno, California, 9 family members were found dead in a single home, killed by someone who claimed to love them. In Colorado, a father stood before news cameras begging for his missing family's return, while knowing exactly where their bodies lay. In France, an entire family vanished without a trace, leaving only questions and a father who seemed to disappear into thin air. These aren't random acts of violence. They're calculated decisions made by people who sat at dinner tables, attended school plays, and tucked their children into bed at night. People who smiled in family photos, planned birthday parties, and bought Christmas presents. What pushes someone to murder their own flesh and blood? In the quiet neighborhoods of Fresno, California, Marcus Wesson blended in just enough to avoid scrutiny. His imposing figure, 6 feet tall with flowing dreadlocks, would catch your eye, but neighbors merely saw a religious man who kept to himself. But behind the weathered walls of his Hammond Avenue home, a horror story was unfolding that would shake this community to its core. The roots of this nightmare stretch back to Kansas, 1946. Marcus Wesson entered this world like any other child, but something twisted inside him early. After a stint in the military, he returned with a darkness that would define his legacy. That's when he met Elizabeth Solorio, just a child at 8 years old. In a move that should have raised every red flag, Wesson manipulated her family, grooming her until, at 15, he convinced them to let him marry her. This wasn't just the beginning of a marriage. It was the first step in creating his own personal cult. Wesson's house became a fortress of manipulation. The Bible wasn't just a holy book in his hands, it was a weapon. He'd spend hours interpreting Scripture, crafting a twisted theology where he wasn't just a father or husband, he was Jesus Christ himself. His children never knew birthday parties or school friends. Instead, they learned that their father was divine, that the outside world was evil, and that death was preferable to leaving him. Neighbors would later recall disturbing details they'd dismissed. Young women in long, dark dresses, walking in perfect formation behind Wesson, heads bowed, never speaking unless spoken to. Inside those walls, something even more sinister was happening. Wesson was conducting what he called marriages with his own daughters and nieces, fathering children with them in a horrific web of abuse that spanned generations. The morning of March 12, 2004, started like any other in Fresno. But by afternoon, everything would change. 2 mothers, finally finding the courage to reclaim their children, arrived at Wesson's door. When he refused, they called the police. What happened next still haunts the responding officers. Wesson, with chilling calmness, walked inside and shut the door. For 80 excruciating minutes, police waited outside, unaware of the horror unfolding within. When they finally entered, the scene defied comprehension. In a back room, 9 bodies lay stacked like firewood. Each victim, aged from just 1 to 25 years old, had been shot through the eye with surgical precision. The youngest were children he'd fathered with his own daughters and nieces. During the trial, Wesson sat emotionless as prosecutors unveiled decades of systematic abuse. They revealed marriage contracts he'd written for underage girls, detailed his teachings about murder-suicide pacts, and exposed how he'd maintained absolute control over his family's minds and bodies. Most chilling were the testimonies of surviving family members, some defending him even then, their minds still trapped in his web of manipulation. Today, Marcus Wesson sits on death row, but the ripples of his crimes continue to spread. Some family members have broken free, while others remain psychologically shackled to his influence. His case stands as a stark reminder that sometimes the most dangerous monsters aren't hiding in the shadows. They're leading prayers at the dinner table. On August 13, 2018, in the picturesque suburb of Frederick, Colorado, Shanann Watts's friend Nicole Atkinson stood anxiously on a front porch, pressing the doorbell repeatedly. Hours earlier, she'd dropped Shanann off from a business trip at 2 a.m. Now, Shanann wasn't answering calls, had missed a doctor's appointment, and her car, with her purse and phone inside, sat untouched in the garage. Something was terribly wrong. The seemingly perfect life of the Watts family was splashed across social media. Shanann's frequent posts showed a devoted husband, Chris, playing with their beautiful daughters, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste. Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant with their son, whom they planned to name Nico. Their Facebook photos painted a picture of the American dream, but like many carefully curated social media lives, darkness lurked beneath the surface. As police conducted their initial welfare check, Chris Watts arrived home from work, appearing concerned but oddly detached. He casually let officers in, walking through rooms where he knew his family would never be found alive again. The search for the missing mother and daughters began, and Chris Watts stepped in front of news cameras, delivering a performance that would later chill viewers to their core. "Shanann, Bella, Celeste, if you're out there, just come back," he pleaded, his voice barely wavering. "If somebody has her, just bring her back. I need to see everybody. I need to see everybody again. This house is not complete without anybody here." Those who watched live thought they were seeing a desperate husband and father. In reality, they were witnessing one of the most calculated performances in criminal history. As the community rallied, organizing search parties and prayer vigils, Chris maintained his facade. But investigators noticed subtle inconsistencies. His body language during interviews raised red flags. He crossed his arms defensively, looked down while speaking about his family, and showed more anxiety about his missing phone than his missing children. Then came the breakthrough. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's house showed Chris loading his truck early that Monday morning, making multiple trips with suspicious cargo. When confronted with evidence of an affair with his co-worker Nicole Kessinger, the facade began to crack. In a polygraph test, Chris failed miserably. After hours of interrogation and a pivotal conversation with his father, Chris finally revealed the truth. A truth so horrific, it would haunt investigators for years to come. He had strangled Shanann in their bedroom after an argument about their relationship. What followed was perhaps the most heartbreaking detail of all. Little Bella had walked in during or after her mother's murder, asking, "What's wrong with Mommy?" Chris then drove his wife's body, with his still-living daughters, to his worksite at the Anadarko oil field. There, he smothered Bella and Celeste, one after the other, pushing their small bodies through 8-inch openings into separate oil tanks. He buried Shanann and their unborn son in a shallow grave nearby. The impact on the community was devastating. Frederick, Colorado, a town where people left their doors unlocked, would never be the same. The house on Saratoga Trail became a memorial site, with strangers leaving teddy bears, flowers, and cards. But the ripples spread far beyond Colorado. The case captured international attention, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about domestic violence and the facades we present to the world. In court, Chris Watts accepted a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. He received 3 consecutive life sentences plus 84 years. During the sentencing, Shannan's father, Frank Rizuchek, called him a heartless monster and said he carried them out like trash. The most haunting details emerged from prison, where Chris finally revealed that Bella had fought for her life, begging him to stop, her last words being, "Daddy, no!" Today, the Watts house stands empty, a silent reminder of the horror that occurred inside its walls. The case has spawned countless documentaries, books, and social media discussions, all trying to understand how a man could destroy his beautiful family for a fresh start with his mistress. Chris Watts sits in a Wisconsin prison, where he reportedly keeps photos of his victims in his cell, a detail that perhaps speaks to the complexity of evil and the human capacity for compartmentalization. The Watts family murders force us to question everything we think we know about the people closest to us, about the masks we wear, and about the thin line between love and unfathomable violence. Sometimes the monsters don't hide under beds or in closets. Sometimes they smile at us from family photos, coach Little League, and tuck their children into bed at night. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying truth of all. In the historic city of Nantes, France, the Dupont de Ligonnes family embodied old-world aristocracy. Xavier, who claimed descent from French nobility, lived with his wife Agnès and their 4 children, Arthur, Thomas, Anne, and Benoit, in an elegant townhouse on Boulevard Schumann. They were the very picture of upper-middle-class French life. Private Catholic schools, music lessons, and family vacations. But beneath this carefully maintained veneer of respectability, Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès was orchestrating his family's extinction. By early 2011, Xavier's carefully constructed world was crumbling. His business ventures had failed spectacularly, leaving him drowning in debt. He'd inherited nothing from his father's death except a family name that demanded maintaining appearances. While Agnès earned a steady income as a teaching assistant at a Catholic school, Xavier's pride couldn't bear the shame of financial failure. But what happened next wasn't a desperate man's sudden breakdown. It was something far more chilling. In the weeks leading up to April 2011, Xavier methodically prepared for what would become known as l'affaire Dupont de Ligonnès. He took shooting lessons at a local gun club. He purchased garbage bags, lime, and cement. He told neighbors his wife had received a job offer in Australia through the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration. He claimed they were entering witness protection. Every detail was meticulously planned, every story carefully crafted. Between April 3rd and 5th, Xavier executed his family one by one. First came his wife Agnès, then the children. Thomas, 18, Arthur, 21, Anne, 16, and finally, little Benoit, just 13. Each was drugged with sleeping pills, then shot twice in the head with a .22 caliber rifle. He even killed the family's 2 Labrador retrievers. But it's what happened next that revealed the true extent of his calculated nature. Xavier wrapped each body carefully in Hessian sacks, covered them in quicklime, and buried them under the terrace of their home. He planted a note claiming the family was leaving for Australia under witness protection. Then, over several days, he methodically cleaned the house, sent emails from his family members' accounts, and even arranged for mail to be forwarded. On April 15th, neighbors finally reported the family missing. When police arrived at the house on Boulevard Schumann, they found it spotlessly clean. Too clean. Cadaver dogs led investigators to the terrace, where they made their grim discovery. 5 bodies, meticulously buried, each with 2 bullet wounds to the head and skull. The scene was so precisely arranged that investigators initially believed it must have taken multiple people to execute. But Xavier had vanished. The last confirmed sighting was on April 15th, when security cameras captured him walking away from a budget hotel in Roquebrune-sur-Argent, carrying a backpack. He had withdrawn 30,000 euros from various accounts, and his face was last seen on CCTV footage disappearing into the mountains of southern France. The manhunt became one of France's most extensive and expensive. Interpol alerts were issued. Reported sightings came from as far as South America and Southeast Asia. In 2019, there was a momentary flutter of excitement when police arrested a man in Glasgow who looked remarkably like Xavier. But it wasn't him. The theories about Xavier's fate are as numerous as they are fascinating. Some believe he succeeded in starting a new life abroad, possibly in South America, where his aristocratic manner and perfect English would help him blend into expat communities. Others insist he died by suicide in the French mountains, his body hidden so well it may never be found. A few conspiracy theorists even suggest he was indeed working for the DEA, and the entire family is alive in witness protection, though the bodies under the terrace definitively disprove this. What makes this case particularly haunting is its methodical nature. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of madness. Xavier spent weeks planning every detail, from the murder weapon to the cover story. He killed his family, not in anger, but with the same careful precision with which he'd once managed his business affairs. Today, the Boulevard Schumann house stands as a silent monument to this tragedy. Xavier Dupont de Ligonnes remains France's most wanted man, his aristocratic face still appearing occasionally on Interpol's most wanted list. The case has become a national obsession in France, spawning countless documentaries, books, and theories. Perhaps most chilling is the question that haunts investigators. How many other Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès are out there? How many seemingly perfect fathers and husbands are capable of such calculated evil? In the end, this case reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous predators aren't those who act on impulse, but those who plan, calculate, and execute with terrifying precision. November 9th, 1971. The Grand Victorian Mansion at 431 Hillside Avenue in Westfield, New Jersey, stood in eerie silence. Inside, the haunting sounds of organ music drifted through the home's intercom system. A recording that would play for weeks. 19 rooms, once filled with life, now harbored death's heavy stillness. But John List, the architect of this horror, was already hundreds of miles away. For years, List portrayed the perfect image of an American family man. Each Sunday, he'd lead his family down the church aisle, his wife Helen, mother Alma, and 3 children, Patricia, Frederick, and John Jr. He taught Sunday school, served as a church elder, and carried his Bible everywhere. His crisp suits, wire-rimmed glasses, and methodical manner earned him respect in the community. No one suspected the pressure building inside this seemingly devout accountant's mind. Months earlier, List's carefully constructed world began to crack. He lost his job, but couldn't bear the shame. Every morning, he'd put on his suit, kiss his wife goodbye, and drive to the train station. There, he'd spend hours reading newspapers, too proud to admit his failure. The family's magnificent 19-room mansion, with its Tiffany skylight worth thousands, was sliding into foreclosure. His wife Helen's medical bills piled up. His teenage daughter Patricia's interest in acting seemed, to his warped religious mind, a path to moral corruption. On that cold November morning, List executed a plan he'd contemplated for months. After his children left for school, he shot Helen in the back of the head as she sipped her morning coffee in the kitchen. The bullet lodged in the cabinet, a detail investigators would later uncover. He walked upstairs to the third-floor apartment where his 85-year-old mother, Alma, lived. One shot ended her life as she stood near her bed. Then List waited. Patricia, 16, returned from school first. She never saw the gun coming. Frederick, 13, arrived next. Then 15-year-old John Jr. One by one, they entered their home for the last time. List shot each child in the back of the head, arranging their bodies meticulously on sleeping bags in the mansion's ballroom. He placed his wife and children side by side, laying their arms across their chests. His mother he left in her apartment. With cold precision, List cleaned every crime scene. He turned down the mansion's heat, turned on the lights, and started the organ music. He cut his face out of every family photograph, canceled milk delivery, stopped mail service, and wrote a chilling 5-page confession to his pastor. The letter detailed his twisted logic. He believed poverty would lead his family to abandon their faith. In his mind, murder was preferable to spiritual corruption. For 18 years, John List disappeared into America. He crafted a new identity as Robert Clark, moved to Colorado, and eventually settled in Richmond, Virginia. He remarried, found work as an accountant, and continued attending church every Sunday. His new neighbors saw a quiet, religious man who kept to himself. The breakthrough came in 1989 when America's Most Wanted aired a revolutionary segment. Forensic artist Frank Bender had created an age-progressed bust of List, accounting for weight gain, hair loss, and aging. The sculpture was so accurate that List's former neighbor in Denver recognized him immediately. On June 1, 1989, as List sat at his accounting desk in Richmond, living his carefully constructed lie, FBI agents walked in. The mask he'd worn for 18 years finally shattered. The mild-mannered accountant who killed his entire family was finally facing justice. During his trial, List remained emotionless, his face a blank slate as prosecutors detailed his crimes. He spoke of financial pressure and religious duty with the same methodical tone he once used in Sunday school. Even when confronted with his family's photographs, he showed no remorse. The jury needed only 4 hours to reach their verdict: guilty on 5 counts of first-degree murder. 5 consecutive life terms. No possibility of parole. John List died in prison in 2008, at age 82, still clinging to his twisted justification. In his final prison interview, he chillingly stated, "I knew it was wrong, but I had to save their souls." The Hillside Avenue mansion burned down in 1972, its famous Tiffany skylight destroyed. Today, a new house stands there, but locals say the weight of what happened that November morning still hangs heavy in the air. 112 Ocean Avenue, Amityville, Long Island. The white Dutch colonial house stood proud against the November sky in 1974. Behind its distinctive eye-like windows, the Daufayot family lived what appeared to be a comfortable middle-class life. But within those walls, Ronald Butch DeFeo Sr. ruled with an iron fist, and his namesake, Ronald Jr., was brewing with a darkness that would spawn America's most infamous, haunted house story. Young Butch DeFeo was a troubled soul from the start. Growing up in a volatile household, he learned early that violence solved problems. His father, a successful Buick dealership manager, was known for his explosive temper and physical abuse. By his teens, Butch was heavily into drugs, had a history of petty crime, and was known to brandish weapons when angry. The family's attempts to help him, including a $14,000 cash gift to start fresh, only seemed to fuel his resentment. On the night of November 13, 1974, at approximately 3:15 a.m., Butch DeFeo methodically moved through the family home with a .35 caliber Marlin rifle. The sequence was brutal and precise. First, his parents, Ronald Sr. and Louise, shot in their bed. Then his younger sisters, Dawn and Allison, and his brothers, Mark and John Matthew. All 6 victims were found face down in their beds, shot multiple times. Most disturbing was that none of the victims appeared to have struggled. In a house where sound carried easily, not one person seemed to have been awakened by the gunshots. The next day, Butch burst into Henry's Bar, a local establishment where he was a regular, screaming, "You got to help me! I think my mother and father are shot." When police arrived at the house, they found a scene that would haunt them forever. The methodical placement of the bodies, the cold precision of the killings, it didn't fit the typical pattern of a family annihilation. Initially, DeFeo played the part of the grieving son perfectly. He suggested to police that a mob hitman, Louis Fellini, might be responsible. But his story quickly unraveled under questioning. Within 24 hours, he confessed, uttering the chilling words, "Once I started, I just couldn't stop." It went so fast. The trial that followed captured national attention. DeFeo's defense attorney, William Weber, pursued an ambitious insanity defense, claiming his client heard voices commanding him to kill his family. DeFeo testified that the voices told him his family was plotting against him. He claimed the house itself had driven him to murder. But the prosecution painted a different picture. A calculating killer who knew exactly what he was doing, who had even staged the crime scene to make it appear more mysterious. The jury didn't buy the insanity defense. On November 21, 1975, Ronald DeFeo Jr. was found guilty of 6 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms. But the story of 112 Ocean Avenue was far from over. Just 13 months after the murders, the Lutz family moved into the house. They fled 28 days later, claiming to have experienced terrifying paranormal phenomena. Their story became The Amityville Horror, a best-selling book and film franchise that forever linked the DeFeo murders to supernatural forces. The house became America's most famous haunted residence, spawning countless books, movies, and paranormal investigations. The cultural impact of the DeFeo murders extends far beyond true crime. It spawned an entire supernatural industry, with every aspect of the case scrutinized for paranormal significance. Yet beneath the sensational headlines and Hollywood adaptations lies a stark truth. 6 innocent people were murdered in their beds by someone they trusted and loved. Today, Ronald DeFeo Jr.'s legacy is a complex web of true crime and urban legend. He died in custody in 2021, never having shown genuine remorse for his crimes. The house on Ocean Avenue still stands, though its address has been changed to discourage tourists. Its distinctive windows still look out over the water, like eyes watching the countless people who still drive by, hoping to catch a glimpse of something supernatural. But perhaps the real horror of the DeFeo case isn't in any alleged haunting. It's in the ordinary nature of family violence, in the way a troubled young man's rage turned a peaceful suburban home into a house of horrors. The true legacy of 112 Ocean Avenue isn't in ghost stories or movie franchises. It's in the 6 lives cut short on a cold November night, in a tragedy that reminds us that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are all too human.